Ken W. Penders II. For most, it's a name that holds little meaning. But for those deeply invested in the fictional worlds that make up the Sonic universe, or for those particularly interested in controversial copyright disputes, the name Ken Penders strikes a particular chord. But why is his name considered such a bad omen? And why does his story have such an air of notoriety around it? To understand his controversy here in the present, we have to go back to the past. In 1992, the Sonic comics series really began. It drew little inspiration from the games, and was based mostly off the Sat AM cartoon. A year into its production, the current writer left, leaving a vacancy needing to be filled. Thus enters a young Ken Penders. Though Penders did have some experiences working in the comic book industry, this would be his first time as a lead writer. He would later state that he and the team behind the Sonic comics had very little creative direction at the time, and Ken hit the ground running. He took the somewhat silly, comparatively tame comic in a wild direction, with complicated plot lines about trauma, fascism, and even Sonic learning the true meaning of war at one point. Though his contributions to the series were undoubtedly a bit eccentric, he took the Sonic comics in a really new direction that the franchise had never really explored, and created as many as 200 new original characters. Granted, the vast majority of these characters would be one-off side characters, or, Knuckles' 6,000th distant cousin, but it was certainly a breath of fresh air for the franchise. So, if you don't know what the Sonic franchise is, Sonic the Hedgehog is a Japanese video game developed by Sega back in the early 90s. The game follows the titular character Sonic the Hedgehog, the fastest being on Earth, and his battle against the evil Dr. Eggman. The game was an instant hit, spawning an enormous franchise spanning hundreds of characters, iterations, and universes. Despite spending so many years creating content for an IP that was based off of a video game, Ken Penders himself has admitted that he's not much of a gamer. So in 2006, when Sega urged Penders to add the character Shadow the Hedgehog from the 2006 Shadow the Hedgehog game, Penders finally decided that enough was enough and left Archie Comics in search of greater things. Now, had the story ended here, Ken Penders would probably be remembered as a somewhat weird, but essential member of what made the Sonic comics and the Sonic franchise as a whole so memorable. Unfortunately, that would not be the case, and very soon would be the beginning of the end. The year is 2008. A video game development company called BioWare develops a Sonic game called Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood for the Nintendo DS. Critics found the game to be resoundingly mediocre. The game would ultimately fade from most of the public's general perception fairly fast, all except for one very particular member of the public, Ken W. Penders. As mentioned before, Ken Penders didn't really play any of the Sonic games, but fans of his reached out and asked whether or not he'd been involved with the creation of Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood, as the game drew much inspiration from all different forms of Sonic media, including the comics, especially when concerning the game's Nocturnus clan, which was very obviously inspired by Penders' own Dark Legion, a group that he had created while he was still writing for the Sonic comics. Upon learning that Sega was using his characters, Penders was infuriated. In his mind, they were using his own original characters, and since he no longer worked with them, he felt that Sega wasn't allowed to profit from his work. Now, technically Sega did still own these characters and the rights to use them, but still angered by this perceived misuse, Penders went back and asked to see an original copy of his contract from Archie Comics. A little while later, Archie would come back to him and say they couldn't find it. They had lost his original contract. At this revelation, Penders does the unthinkable. He files for ownership for everything. The US Copyright Office, of course, informed both Archie Comics and Sega of this filing and allowed them a chance to respond. Neither of them did. By default, Penders' copyright claims were certified, and he was officially acknowledged by the US government as owning everything he had filed for. as his own intellectual property. Speaking on the debacle at the time, Penders himself said he was now able to, quote, use any legal means deemed necessary to protect and preserve his work from Archie Comics, giving him the grounds to file a lawsuit against Sega and Electronic Arts for copyright infringement in the Sonic Chronicles video game. Realizing what had just happened, Archie Comics filed a lawsuit against Penders in an attempt to regain control of the characters they had effectively let slip out of their hands. They claimed that Penders was on a work-for-hire contract, and thus all characters he created were ultimately owned by Sega. However, in yet another grand show of incompetence from Archie, the only copy of Penders' contract they could find was a photocopied contract that he had signed 2 years after he began work there, because his original contract had been destroyed. Penders was quick to allege that this photocopy was a forgery. Realizing how badly they had fumbled this case, Archie chose the nuclear option and fired their entire legal team and fully replaced it. The new legal team confirming that, quote, prior counsel blew it. Ultimately, Archie and Penders came to a sort of half-truce. Penders would be allowed to gain the rights for the estimated 200 characters that he had created for the Archie comics. As a result, Archie wouldn't pursue legal action. At the same time this is happening, Penders is also still in a suit with Sega and EA. However, the case is dismissed as the judge informs both parties that the outcome from the Archie case would directly affect the rulings of the Sega and EA case. Despite this, Penders refiled the case just 4 days later. The suit was quickly dismissed again by the same judge. The case against Sega would end there in a stalemate. And this meant that while Penders was allowed to use his characters, he was not allowed to do so in a way that closely replicated the Sonic art style, and he would be unable to file again. So, yes, after a long legal battle, Penders finally had ownership of his original characters. To us, he may seem somewhat like an underdog artist sticking it to the big corporation. Why is it then that he's so widely disliked by the majority of the Sonic fandom? Well, though the legal cases had come to a close, the consequences of these cases were only beginning. First, let's talk about what happened with Archie Comics. Despite the fact that Penders granted ACP limited use of his characters under certain situations, ACP instead went with the mind-blowing decision to completely reboot the series. In the lore of the comic, the universe was effectively destroyed, and all 200 plus of Penders' characters were wiped from existence. This obviously greatly upset fans who had been keeping up with the series that they adored. And as Penders wasn't allowed to use his newly acquired characters in any way that was closely related to the Sonic franchise, many of the plot lines and character arcs, and even the giant cliffhanger at the end could never be resolved. The vast majority of the past 2 decades were gone in an instant. Another consequence came in the form of mandates. After the absolute disaster that had occurred over the past few years, Sega went from allowing a good amount of creative freedom to laying down heavy mandates on any Sonic the Hedgehog related content. Some of these mandates are as follows. All use of Penders' characters or any of his content was strictly forbidden. Sonic was no longer allowed to lose. Main or significant characters were forbidden to form romantic relationships. And the kicker, Sonic is not allowed to show excessive emotion. There are even more mandates that were laid down that are not available to public eye, and was a huge blow to the possible future stories that could have been told with the Sonic franchise. Many fans blame Ken Penders and his lawsuits for the eventual cancellation of the Archie Sonic comics. Obviously, the lawsuits had a huge impact on both Ken Penders' reputation and the future of the Sonic franchise, but they weren't the only thing that turned off the Sonic fandom to Ken Penders. Let's discuss some of the lore, controversy, and somewhat weird happenings that seem to surround Ken Penders. So now that Penders had gained the rights to all of his characters, he wanted to put them to good use. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to draw them in a way that would associate them with the Sonic franchise. So Ken Penders decided to take a somewhat different approach to the interpretation of these characters. For example, here's the project he's working on now. This is the Laura Sue Chronicles. When Penders still wrote for the Archie comics, Laura Sue was daughter of Knuckles the Echidna. She's now instead the daughter of Nox the Echidna. No relation. Yeah, it's probably not hard to discern that fans who had adored these comics didn't really love that this seems to be the only foreseeable future for these characters. Obviously, the art style is not the most appealing to general audiences, but the bigger issue is that Penders has been working on the Laura Sue Chronicles for over 12 years now. So even if fans were willing to stick it out, it seems unlikely that they'll get to see their favorite characters again anytime soon. Penders also has a very active Twitter presence, and oftentimes says things many would consider to be kind of controversial. Here he is arguing about the age of consent of one of his characters. Here he is drawing fetish art. Here he is trying to get into the NFT game, promising that each NFT with one of his very original characters will be priced at $100,000. Perhaps the most well-known controversy comes with his licensing of the character Scourge. Scourge was initially created as one of Ken Penders' characters, Evil Sonic, who wore a leather jacket and sunglasses, but he eventually evolved into this. Now, Penders did own the concept of Scourge and was allowed to license it out. He licensed Scourge out to an indie company named Rush Comics to create a comic book series called Scourge, the Speed Demon. The design they used of Scourge wasn't created by Penders, it was created by another artist. An even bigger controversy came when it was revealed that the company was headed by an alleged white supremacist. So ultimately, Ken has a lot going against him in regards to his popularity amongst the Sonic fandom. But where I think the biggest issue really lies is in his treatment of other people. Ken is often described by others as arrogant and narcissistic, and that impression really does show when you read some of the comments that he's made before. Back in 2002, Sonic the Hedgehog writer Ben Hurst had an idea to create a film that continued on the animated series that had originally spawned the Sonic the Hedgehog comics. Penders was excited about this opportunity and called Hurst asking to be included. Hurst says that he, quote, generously offered to include Penders in the effort and told Penders his strategy. Later though, when Hurst would contact Sega again, they were extremely hostile and shot down the idea. Hurst theorized that Penders had gone behind his back and told Sega that he was attempting to commandeer the project and Sonic as his own, and ultimately made it so that his pitch was rejected. Corroborating the story, Penders would soon after pitch his own idea for a Sonic film, which ultimately fell through. He would go on to insult Ben Hurst after he had died. Ian Flynn, a writer for the Sonic comics who would take over after Penders left, used to be a big fan of Penders, but Ken now openly mocks him online. And ultimately, there are many other things that he said that make him come off as not the most likable guy. I think it's easy to see why Penders is such a controversial figure in the Sonic fandom. But what lesson should be taken from this whole disastrous experience? Ken hasn't worked on anything Sonic related since 2006. Not officially, anyway. And yet, it seems to completely consume his life and identity. I think the tale of Ken Penders should be a cautionary tale to passionate artists. There's a whole sea of creative endeavors out there to explore. An ocean of possibility. But you've got to learn to ride the waves. If you don't swim, you'll sink.